So, on my part, first of all, I would like to thank very much Professor Karniadakis for accepting this invite and some logistics. This will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by questions. So we will have at least 15 minutes for questions. And with that, I would like to ask our rector, Professor Boudouvis, to formally introduce our speaker, and then we can start with the presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sava. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, just to make sure that all time zones of the attendees are covered. Kalispera for the local Greek community from the National Technical University of Athens and other Greek universities and institutions. Dear colleagues, dear students and attendees, it sounds so promising, refreshing, and inspiring to blend data and physics for getting fast predictions. It seems that our speaker has a very good recipe for that, and for physics-informed neural networks and neural networks that learn functionals and nonlinear operators. I am not supposed to be here to elaborate on my enthusiasm about these developments, but to welcome and introduce our speaker, Professor George Karniadakis from Brown University. This is in accordance to the instructions I got from my colleague, Professor Triantafyllou, and today's webinar organizers from the Institute for Structural Analysis and Anti-Seismic Research of the School of Civil Engineering of ΝΤUA. Dear George, it's my pleasure representing your alma mater to welcome you and thank you for your availability to share your research findings and ideas with the ΝΤUA community and beyond. George Karniadakis is a professor in the Division of Applied Mathematics at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. George is from Crete. He graduated from the School of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering in 1982. He got a master's degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Department of Mechanical Engineering in 1984. And in 1986, he got his PhD, again from MIT, in mechanical engineering with a minor in applied mathematics. He was appointed lecturer in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at MIT, and then he joined the Center for Turbulent Research at Stanford, NASA Ames. He joined Princeton University as assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and as associate faculty in the program of Applied Mathematics, Applied and Computational Mathematics. He was a visiting professor at Caltech in 1993 in the Aeronautics Department and joined Brown University as associate professor of applied math in the Center for Fluid Mechanics in 1994. After becoming a full professor in 1996, he continued to be a visiting professor and senior lecturer of ocean mechanical engineering at MIT. George is a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, the SIAM, fellow of the American Physical Society, and fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Among his many distinctions and awards, I mention a couple of very recent ones: the SIAM Association for Computing Machinery Prize on Computational Science and Engineering, just last year, and the most recent one, a few months ago, his election to the National Academy of Engineering, with his election citation reading as follows: for computational tools from high accuracy algorithms to machine learning and applications to complex flows, stochastic processes, and microfluidics. What appears as a motto in George's research group page is Richard Feynman's statement: people who wish to analyze nature without using mathematics must settle for a reduced understanding. In the same page, I read that his current research interests are on machine learning for scientific computing, what he calls scientific machine learning. That is, how to solve and discover new PDEs via deep learning, hence removing the tyranny of grids and using gappy data only. As for teaching, just 4 courses: Introduction to Computational Linear Algebra, Numerical Solution of Partial Differential Equations 1 and 2, and Multiscale Computational Fluid Dynamics. As I just mentioned, as far as I remember, George has been with us here in ΝΤUA 10 years ago, in March 2012, and he gave a talk at that time entitled Multiscale Modeling of Physical and Biological Systems. Well, it was about time, George, that you have today's webinar here in ΝΤUA. I wish you all to enjoy the talk and the discussion that will follow. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. Let me see if I can share my screen. And please let me know if you can see my screen, if you can hear me.
Okay.
Loud and clear. Yep.
Thank you for the introduction and the generous introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be back. I wish I was there with you in person. I remember it was a great question session at the end of my talk. But since we are in a friendly environment, I want to start with this animation that shows flow over an espresso cup, something that we can relate. We know you're all from different departments and different backgrounds. Now, this is, of course, not the most technological problem I could start with, but it does make a point that I want to focus on my talk, and that is, if you're given some data like a video, a Slidden photography, an old technique goes all the way back to 60s, so when people were trying to visualize high-speed flows and shocks. So Slidden photography captures the gradients, the thermal gradients in the stratified medium. What can you say quantitatively from this qualitative information about the velocity, the pressure, and so on? Now this, you can appreciate that this is an ill-posed problem, but somehow I managed to convince this company, LaVision. It's a German company. It's a for-profit company. So they did these experiments for me, as you can see on the right, where they have multiple cameras and so on, and they reconstructed a 3D plume of the coffee, of the flow over the espresso cup. And then they said, okay, these are the data that we give you, a video. Can you infer the velocity and the pressure in 3D and time? Clearly, that's an ill-posed problem. It cannot be done with existing technologies, and I will get back to it. Now, as I said, this is not the most technological problem, but there are other real problems. So let me start with this one, which is a real problem, or a real brain aneurysm in my collaboration here at Boston Children's Hospital. What you see here is a brain artery, which has this dilation. And this is a dye, a contrasting agent that my collaborator and neurosurgeon, Joe Marchen, is injecting to the patient. And based on his own opinion, he may or may not operate on this patient. There's nothing quantitative about it. And again, can I extract quantitative information, for example, the stresses on the aneurysmal wall, the pressure on the aneurysmal wall, just from this video, because that's what is available to the doctor in the clinic. Okay, going more into engineering, what you're seeing here is a real material, aluminum alloy, and there's a surface crack somewhere in the middle here. Let me just mark it. I don't know if you can see it. It's a surface tiny crack, and the question is, this could be like in an airplane in a wing of an airplane. Again, these are real data from the Air Force lab at Wright-Patterson in Ohio, in the United States. So given that information, a video basically of ultrasound, can you locate tiny cracks like this for inspection reasons and non-destructive evaluation of materials. And then yet another problem is these days renewables are very hot area, as you can appreciate. This is up in Boulder, Colorado, where there's a NREL, the Department of Energy. So the question is, given an input, can you, of solar irradiance, for example, and the ambient temperature there at Boulder, can you infer the state of the charge that this combined solar system and thermal system, this organic Rankine cycle, will produce in the future, so that you can forecast the energy output for the next few days. So you can see these are all ill-posed problems. There's very little information. There's some data, but the data is not where you want them. There's no particular governing equations. You have to postulate, you have to make up models yourself and to improvise. So this is what I'm talking about, how we can integrate data and physical laws. And in the past, at least in computational science and engineering, most of the time we'll have this scenario on the left where we pretend, anyway, that we know all the physics, and then we have just the small data conveniently located at the boundaries and as initial conditions. However, this is not what happens in real life. As you appreciate, you all work on engineering problems. Most of the times we have some physics, and then we don't know most of it, or half of it. For example, in reactive transport, we know how to write down mathematical equations for advection and diffusion, but we don't know what the non-equilibrium chemistry is. But we may have some data. So I'm going to talk about that topic in the context of PINs, physics-informed neural networks. And yet there are many complex systems. It's easy to imagine, for example, a social dynamic system for which you don't have any physics. But even if you do understand the physics, it's a complex system, so you cannot afford to really resolve it. So you have some data. So this could be a data-driven case. So this will give me the opportunity, if I have time, to talk about another level of abstraction that we introduced recently, which is very popular now, and that is operator regression, not just function regression, that almost exclusively the machine learning community is concerned about. So 5 years ago, we considered how we can incorporate physics into machine learning, and we started this center for the Department of Energy, which I'm a director. It's called FILMS. It's pronounced FILMS, for physics-informed learning machines. And we're looking at a host of functional problems, including functional materials, climate problems like ice melting in the Antarctica, and so on. And these are some of the Sandia National Labs and Pacific Northwest National Lab, where I'm 1/3 employee, and Stanford, MIT, and Santa Barbara and Brown are part of the consortium. Yeah. So the first topic I want to talk about is how we actually integrate data plus physics plus neural networks. Data plus physics is what people would say is data assimilation, very common in geophysics and weather prediction. But here we want to incorporate neural networks. Now, when we first published this paper, and I want to make this point for the students and the postdocs who are out there, this paper was rejected because it was very simple. The idea was very simple. We're removing the grids. We were simplifying things. We didn't have boundary conditions everywhere, and so on. So the paper was rejected. Then finally, was in 2019. You can see a gap of 2 years was published, and it's the most cited paper currently in this area, in this journal. So what is a PIN? I want to explain in very simple and actually demystify the neural networks and the physics-informed neural networks. So a neural network is shown here on the left in this box. So let's say we're trying to evaluate the stresses and the displacements, let's say, in a specimen in solid mechanics. So given x1 and x2, the coordinates, and given data of our measurements, which are called label measurements, label data, sorry, we can basically write down a very simple mismatch or error equation. This will be the label data. This will be the predictions of the neural network. And we correct this and we obtain this mismatch between the predictions and the data. And by trying to minimize this, in other words, taking the derivatives with respect to the weights and the bias. So this neural network is characterized by weights W and bias B. By taking these weights and bias, with respect to the weights and bias, these are the parameters of the system, we can backpropagate, and basically with iterations or what's called epochs, you can minimize this to the maximum degree possible, and therefore in the process obtain through, let's say, steepest gradient descent, we can obtain these weights and bias. Therefore, you're done. Now, in order to do that, you need a lot of data. You need, for that specimen, you need 10,000 measurements, let's say, or more. However, we don't have that many measurements unless you spend 5 years doing measurements of a single specimen, which is counterproductive. But we have conservation laws. We have momentum equation, for example. We have mass conservation and so on. So in this particular case, we have the equations of elasticity, which we can write the displacement in terms of the stresses. So the constitutive laws, for example, depending on the type of material. So we have to take derivatives of this neural network. The neural network is U1 and U2. They represent the displacement, and we simply have to take derivatives of displacement to obtain the stresses. Now, after we do that, let's say for the sake of argument that F1 and F2 are the forces, and these are 0. So in equilibrium, I have to minimize this. In other words, F1 and F2 has to be 0. So I now have another source of information where I can derive data. This is the physics-informed part where I can evaluate the residuals. I call this F1 and F2 residuals, since they have to be 0. If you have forces, you can subtract off the forces. It's not a problem, given forces. So you subtract off the residual, you try to minimize the residual, and in the process, you obtain another source of information, namely this equation which you can evaluate at different points. So at the end, then, what you do, you take a linear combination, let's say a Lagrangian multiplier times the data, the loss in the data, plus a Lagrangian multiplier for the physics times the residuals of the loss in the physics. An important point is how do you actually obtain the derivative operators or the differential operators in this system, because you need to take the derivative of a neural network. That's very simple. You can use, of course, finite differences and so on, but then you need a grid. What we introduce here is a meshless method, namely, we use the same TensorFlow technology that Google introduced to backpropagate the error when we minimize this loss function. We use the same automatic differentiation called AD to obtain this the differential operators. In the process, then we abandon the mesh generation, and as Andrea said, we remove the tyranny of having to generate meshes, which could be very elaborate for very complex engineering systems. I want to demonstrate the simplicity of this because based on this simplicity, as I said, the paper was rejected. So let's start with this problem, which we study in our numerical courses for graduate students. It takes about 6 months to study this. This is the Berger's equation. It has nonlinearities, it has second-order terms, and so on. So we don't discretize space and time. We solve simultaneously in space-time as continuous variables. Now we have some data. Where is the data? Well, the data, I denote the data here by these black crosses, sorry. And you can see here, this is one boundary, the x minus 1. Top is the x plus 1. But if you pay attention here, there's a huge time interval for which I have no boundary data. Just that by itself will prevent you from being able to solve this with existing solvers. However, in this approach, we really need to solve an optimization problem. So as I told you earlier, we just need to take all the data, all these black crosses, and put it in this term. Now, in TensorFlow, which is a Google language in machine learning, it's very popular. You just take one line to write the TensorFlow to define the network, and then three, four lines to take the gradients with respect to time, first derivative and second derivative, and then in three lines later, you basically are ready to have the second term. Therefore, now you have the loss function. After you have the loss function, you could simply call a optimizer that the commercial machine learning community is using to obtain results like this, as you can see here, which are pretty good looking results. You will not be able to obtain this with even good methods because of undershoots and overshoots because of the steep gradients. So 10 minutes later, starting from scratch and having a code of about 10 lines, you can obtain results. In fact, these days, the national labs are substituting their old codes, which have hundreds of thousands of lines, with this type of approach where the longest code I have seen is 500 lines. So 100,000 lines or 200,000 lines code could be reduced to 500 lines of code using this very simple approach. It's so simple that high school students are working on it. For example, here's Jeremy Yu, a high school student from Texas who gave a talk recently at Brown. I invite him to give a talk because he included this extra term in the loss function, which he decided to penalize also not just the residuals, but also the gradients of the residuals, as you can see here. So by doing that, of course, it's like I'm doing a training in Sobolev space by taking higher derivatives. It could be expensive, but as you can see here for this diffusion reaction equation, he gets pretty good results. This is his Jeremy's results compared to what we did, what my postdocs did with PIN. So he basically gave his talk just before his English class from his high school to my group, and he humiliated all my postdocs who didn't think about this very simple idea. So again, it's very simple. A high school student can do it. Recently, we wrote a paper together. He is now a first-year student at MIT. I want to go back to this example I gave about coffee, and I would like to refer to our paper in Science a couple of years ago where we introduced this concept of hidden fluid mechanics. Now, we're looking at a classical problem in fluid mechanics, namely flow past the cylinder, the von Karman Street. But really, what I wanted to know is if I have somewhere downstream of the bluff object a video of the dye visualization. So we can use smoke or we can use dye, iodine or something if you have water, and you track these particles that are colored. Can you use just that video to extract quantitative information, namely the velocity field and the pressure field in that patch, the arbitrary patch? You can see here how we construct the multi-physics now neural network. Of course, we're talking about passive scalar. So I have an advection diffusion equation where the Peclet number is not known. So this is one good thing about it. You don't really need to know, you just need to know the parameterized physics. For example, the Peclet number here is not known. Of course, the Reynolds number is not known. So because we have the entire system as one network, one big network, if we learn, we have data on the passive scalar, and this is sort of the auxiliary. And so I use the term hidden fluid mechanics to refer to hidden Markov processes, where in hidden Markov processes, we have data on auxiliary variables, and we try to find the primary variables here, for example, the pressure and the velocity. So if you learn the auxiliary variables, you know the parameters of the system, therefore you can transfer them to velocity, and also here we impose the constraint, incompressibility constraint. So this is just to show here that indeed, just from those dye visualizations, we can find the velocity and the pressure in time, in space-time, in that patch. If you have a flow visualization around the object, you can see that we can even find the forces here, lift and drag on the body, just from flow visualization. So that was the surprising element. That was why the paper was published there. Now, I want to go back to the realistic example of what my collaborator neurosurgeon sees is this black and white video of the contrasting agent moving slowly around, and then he has to make a decision. So again, very similar to hidden fluid mechanics, we assign some residual equation here. I is the intensity of the image, gray, black, or in between, and then we postulate a model. This is up to us. It's a parameterized model. Again, you can see here, for example, I use non-Newtonian models for the blood flow, and the fluid is incompressible. So this is something that as a modeler, you have to introduce that sort of the physics, but as I said, it doesn't have to be exact. Now, typically, when people are doing CFD simulations with in bioengineering, they use very big domains because they want to be away from the region of interest to avoid the contamination from the boundary conditions. Here, I can afford, because I don't need boundary conditions, I can afford to look at the aneurysmal sac because that's the region of interest, and I can very quickly look at this three-dimensional volume from which I can extract, again, from visualization, black and white, and I can extract the hidden physics. And here, if I can, I will have, let's see if I find, I cannot find, yeah, here. I have a video. Okay, so this is doing simulations actually with a CFD as a reference to show that just doing a big CFD simulation, but and then doing a pin inside the aneurysmal sac, we can capture this unsteady vertical flow. If I have the flow, I can compute the pressure and compute the wall shear stresses. I can look then if this tissue, human tissue, the aneurysmal sac, if the yield stress is smaller or larger, and therefore I can decide about rupture of this aneurysm. Going back to my flow over an espresso cup, this is a recent paper in General Fluid Mechanics. You can see here on the left is one slice of what the Slitting photography captures. I have many of these slices. On the right here, where my cursor is, on the second column, is what I try. The neural network matches that, and then in the process, I can compute the pressure field in 3D. This is just a slice, and also the velocity over the cup. It's not, as I said, an important technological problem. It does make the point. Now, the reason we convinced LaVision to do this experiment for us is because in the beginning of the pandemic, in March 2019, we found this video on YouTube, and we decided to use it without their knowledge to see if we can extract quantitative information on the droplet. You also see the velocity field and around the mouth of my collaborator, Thomas Berg. And since then, we have become partners. And basically, we were able to determine that how much the specific mass could reduce the flow speed and so on. Now, going to another problem of engineering importance is, of course, non-destructive evaluation of materials. We have a big program on that, on the microstructure of different alloys for gas turbines blades, wings of the airplanes, and so on. Here, we don't know exactly. This was, I want to mention that this was if you know what the DARPA is, the advanced, this sort of DoD, Department of Defense agency for research, advanced research. They had a hackathon where 12 teams, all working on neural networks, trying to evaluate to see if they can use neural networks to very quickly identify defects in materials. So what is given, move forward. What is given is this video here, an ultrasound that will go towards the surface crack, but we don't know which direction, of course. Now, the 11 teams complain that they have too few data. So I said, I will use 10% of the data. I will use 10% of the data, but also I will use the physics. Now, the physics here, of course, I know the propagation of sound, but because I have a heterogeneous medium, I will write like this. I will write the speed of sound will be a function of x and y. And then in addition to pin, which is this part that represents the propagation, I also have implicitly to determine the speed of sound as a function of x and y. If I find that and I set that to 0, that contour is basically exactly the surface crack. For those of you who are working in this area, it's a very difficult problem. But indeed, with 10% of the data only, we're able to fully reconstruct the wave propagation, as you can see here on the right, the prediction, and up here is C of x, y, and the blue contour shows exactly where the crack is, so we can identify the crack. This is just one of the many problems that we have looked at on microstructure, including inside the deep into not just the surface crack. This is another problem, kind of a teaser, but it's something that the Navy is interested. These are assumed to be drones that are flying. There are 256 drones in 2 dimensions. So this problem is solved. It's an optimization problem in 512 dimensions. So the dimensionality of the system here is 512. And clearly that's not something that you can solve every day. What happens here is these drones are located in this square and they try to cross to the other wall as fast as possible without colliding. So they have to, so basically you have to find the optimum path in this crowded environment of 256 drones. This takes weeks, if not months, to solve. We were able to use pins and the symplectic integrator we have using Hamilton-Jacobi equations as physics to solve this in less than 1 hour on a single GPU. Okay, so this is something new that we couldn't do or we cannot do with other methods, but using a combination of optimization methods and physics informed, you can solve this type of very difficult problems now. In engineering, we're dealing a lot with design and we have historical data. So we wanted to know how can one use historical data, especially for very expensive experiments where you may have only 2 new measurements. So let's say we model a system, a porous medium, and we know we're trying to determine the permeability of the soil, and I only have 2 new measurements for the hydraulic pressure, and I have on the right-hand side for my sources, I have four measurements. Of course, that's not possible because you don't know the permeability. The permeability is a stochastic field, you don't know it. But you do have historical data, so I take historical data, and also I create what is called physics-informed generative adversarial network. It's something else that we did. GANs, for those of you who have never seen it, is a really powerful idea of adversarial training. It's more like semi-supervised learning. It's not, you don't need a lot of labels. So here we use the historical data to obtain in the Bayesian framework functional priors. Functional priors are basically priors, most informative priors. So using a combination of historical data and pseudo labels from physics-informed GANs and the equations into the GANs, I can obtain the most informative priors. If I do that, then I can basically calibrate with it in a posterior. My posterior only with very few data, and I can obtain not only the prediction of the mean quantities, but also the uncertainty. And you can appreciate how important that is, especially in the context of neural networks. So let me explain this in this pedagogical example where we have a diffusion reaction equation. So the reaction here is cubic in algebraic term here, but Kr is not a constant. It's actually a function, but it's totally unknown. We don't know that. Instead, what we know from historical data, we know its distribution, but I don't have any data. The only data I have is on the right-hand side. I have 10 measurements. So I have 10 blue points. The blue points here are my measurements. And then I have only 2 points, for the state U. Clearly, we cannot solve that problem with because it's you have too few data. But you have, again, you have historical data for the right-hand side and historical data for K of R. So doing the functional priors in the Bayesian framework I show you, we can obtain, as you can see, a good right-hand side, a pretty good solution with uncertainty quantification, and totally discover the totally unknown reaction coefficients which are distributed over the domain. So functional priors are very powerful. Anyway, I want to conclude this part, and I hope I have a little more time to talk about operator regression. But there's lots of different types of pins that my group has published Many other groups have published. There are thousands of papers now on pins for different models trying to mimic existing equations, trying to this extended pins is something that you combine domain decomposition, for example, like finite elements, but big finite elements, and pins, and in each element you have a pin and so on. This is to scale up the problems. There is a library for those of you who are interested in introducing to your classroom or to your research. There's a library called DeepXDE that X stands for anything. Basically, you can dial in a system of ODEs, PDEs, or algebraic constraints, and you can solve PDEs or can solve, as I said, dynamics and so on. This library is very popular, has been downloaded 300,000 times, and lots of companies have created, commercial companies have created, like NVIDIA has created a whole division using pins, and they have a code called Modulus, ANSYS, recently Bosch, that some of you work in, you may know from Europe, they released a version of pins called Physics Torch, which they do different types of applications. As you could appreciate, this is Analytica is a company I started with Aris Rozakis, who is some of you may know from Professor and Dean, former Dean at Caltech, and he's associate also with NTUA. Now, as I said, NVIDIA was among the first companies to jump in this, and here you see their CEO back in 2019 when they hired my postdoc, Maja Raisi, behind my back actually, to start this business, and they now use pins. They just announced they were. Jensen Huang had an interview at the Forbes magazine recently talking about Earth 2, where he wants to tackle the climate problem using Modulus, their code, which is basically 100% pins. Now, pins can be used in many different ways. I didn't expect that I will be working with this company called XTeam. XTeam is a company out of Google, and they're interested in robots that cook. So we are now working with them to use pins for cooking. I cannot say more about it, but we just started working on it. Okay, so let me see how much time I have left. I have about, like, let's say 10 minutes, and I want to switch gears now. I was working on this problem in autonomy with my colleagues at MIT. This shows a naval destroyer, a real one, DDGX 1000, going through sea state 8, which basically means, for those of you who are sailing, means waves of 20 meters. So you're not supposed to be out there in the Aegean doing that. But this destroyer goes through the Atlantic Ocean. So basically you're looking at a specific spectrum for Atlantic Ocean, stochastic excitation. And what we're interested in is, of course, the 6 degrees of motion of this vessel, so that we can, but we need that in real time. Unfortunately, one CFD computation using OpenFOAM takes 1 week. So that's totally useless. CFD in this case is totally useless. So I was wondering if we can actually approximate functionals, because we need all degrees of freedom of the vessel as a function of time, if we can approximate functionals using neural networks. And since I'm on the theoretical side, I wanted to know that I asked the question, do neural networks approximate functionals? We know that they approximate functions, and that's a well-known universal approximation theorem for functions, but how about functionals? So for my good luck, I found a paper that nobody had used before, nobody had cited before. George Saipengo here at Tufts University at that time wrote a paper on functional approximation. Chen and Chen from the University of Fudan in Shanghai wrote a paper where he shows that a single hidden layer, just one layer, can approximate a functional. U now is a function. So f of u is a functional. This can be done in 1D and multi-D. Because these are shallow networks, nobody ever used it. But we extended this to deep neural network. Of course, today there's ready-made neural networks that can satisfy this. Knowing the theory now, you can take, for example, a recurrent neural network subjected to this stochastic excitation, record 3 or 6 degrees of freedom, that will be your label data. Offline, it's a little tedious, only an MIT student will be able to do this. You need to be very patient. So it takes a few months to train this, a couple of months, because of the CFD simulations. If you have real data, you can accelerate this. But then after you do that, basically you dial in a C state, and very quickly you can find in 0.01 seconds. So you reduce the time from 1 week to 0.01 second. So you can do real things, really useful things for autonomy. This could be also true for cars, for airplanes, and so on. Now, I was interested to generalize this idea. Instead of just functionals, I wanted to see if we could approximate operators, in fact, any nonlinear operators. Here in this schematic, I show something that I propose, and that is a composite neural network here on the left. It was partially inspired by the need that my daughter asked me in high school. She wanted to avoid doing calculus, and she asked me if I could produce a neural network that does calculus. So I tried to help her. So I tried to draw an analogy with human neurons. So this one here is the inputs, like the dendrites in the human neuron. This one here is called the trunk, related to the soma, where the calculations are done. And then you cross them to produce a synaptic output, as you can see in a human neuron. So we proposed this in 2019. And then again, I was interested to see if there is a theory behind it. And I will explain the theory, but what we're talking about here is something totally different. This is the classical neural networks. We are looking at one space, finite space, RD1 in imaging, let's say, that we map into a finite dimensional space. What we're trying to introduce is an operator which will take an infinite dimensional function and project it to the output, or map it to an infinite dimensional output. So it's a very, very different, that's why the operator. Of course, if you can do that, you can imagine that there's black box systems that you can identify, systems of systems, social dynamic systems, and so on. So again, for my good luck, I found that Chen and Chen had actually produced a theorem which matches exactly what I propose. As you can see here, and again, he's talking about a single hidden layer. We have an operator G that maps U to G of U of Y. So we're trying to approximate that with the two neural networks, the branch, which I just showed you, and the trunk. You can write this, if you like, something like alpha K phi K of Y. Now, phi K of Y, you can think of this as a basis. So the trunk gives me an adaptive basis. And then alpha K is computed from the inputs. U comes from a compact space, V, and I have M sensors where I can sample or I can measure my function. So I have functions in, and this, of course, will be function output. Of course, these are continuous because we're talking about neural networks. But basically, we have two neural networks working together. And in this schematic, you can see how the mathematics translates into a neural network. So the branch is this part here, the trunk is down here. The problem with this, again, was that a single hidden layer is very limited. For example, we run into the curse of dimensionality right away because operator learning is much more demanding than learning a function. So you do have the curse of, think of a parametric PDE, and you can have 100 parameters, for example. So you run into the curse of dimensionality. However, what we did is to extend the theory of Chen and Chen to deep neural networks. And for deep neural networks, we actually proved that we can beat, theoretically, we proved, and also empirically using numerical tests, we proved that we can beat the curse of dimensionality in the input space, and therefore these neural networks can learn very, very fast. I want to show you an example of it, which is, again, inspired by my daughter's math. And this is how to do an integral from 0 to x dt. Okay, so we map this to s of x. So we map the integrand to an integral. Now, x here is from 0 to 1, but it could be from 0 to infinity. So in which case you do Laplace transforms. So we have done that. It could be one dimension here, or it could be multidimensional. In fact, Los Alamos is using this exact method to do collisional integrals in the Boltzmann equation. So, okay, here, how do we train it? I take 10,000 integrands. Now, where do you take them from? So I have to have an input space. That space for me will be here, the Gauss random fields. So I take 10,000 integrals and I compute this at only one point, s x naught. So I don't, although x is in a continuous regime, I only use 1 point. In other words, you only need one experiment for every excitation. Although I have 10,000 integrands, I only compute the integral at 1 point for each one of them. And by doing that, very quickly you can obtain a mean-square error for as a function of training of number of iterations, which is 10 to the minus 5. You can improve it, and you can show that generalization error, the difference between training and testing, is much better for this than any other network. I want to show you how we can use this in engineering. Here I have a very simple equation, learning to grow bubbles. This is a famous equation by Lord Rayleigh. It's called now the Rayleigh-Plesset equation. You can see it's a very ingenious nonlinear equation, but I will not be using the equation here, unlike the first part of the talk. Here I use supervised learning. So the input here is the pressure difference between the bubble and the ambient. And then I want to find R as a function of T, given the viscosity and the surface tension. So what we do, we train the neural network, the DeepONet, with the different pressures, and then we record corresponding radii as a function of time. And then if you do that many times, as I show you, just with the integration, you train the system. Here's an example. Now we will test this network for unseen pressure distributions, and you can see on purpose I take arbitrary pressure distributions. The corresponding R, so I have 3 bubbles here, R1 of T, is shown like here. You can see it's multi-rate dynamics. It's very fast. This bubble breathes very fast, and then eventually viscosity and surface tension dominate. For 3 different excitations, I have 3 different responses. Very hard to see if DeepONet, the difference between DeepONet and the exact solution of the Rayleigh-Plesset equation. So again, here I use just the PDE, the ODE here to generate data, but DeepONet learned to solve this ODE in 0 time. DeepONet, unlike pins, we don't train it anymore. It just infers. We train it offline. Of course, we're interested in the entire regime. I wanted to do Nano Bubbles. And this is a talk I gave in 2012 at НΤUA on dissipative particle dynamics, stochastic molecular dynamics. So if the bubbles are very small, they fluctuate. And you can see here, again, the radius has fluctuations and so on. But the question is, can we train DeepONet to learn DPD or molecular dynamics? Because one simulation like this takes about 48 hours. Instead, DeepONet will produce this in 0.01 second. So indeed, and this is a recent paper in General Fluid Mechanics, we train, not only that, we were able to, if this is the initial radius of the bubble, and somewhere here, this is where the demarcation line, this is the continuum, this is the atomistic. So we fed DeepONet with data from atomistic simulations and from continuum simulations, and we're able to have a seamless multi-scale operator that will grow bubbles from nano bubbles to bigger bubbles. This is the example I showed you earlier for this solar panel together with the organic Rankine cycle. So the only inputs to the network, again, this is a black box. We need to learn. The operator now is not a mathematical operator. It's all the system. It's a black box. So the input is the temperature of the ambient and the irradiance. This is the clouds here. So if let's say an NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, is out there in Boulder, Colorado, if you can predict from weather predictions the temperature in the next couple of days, basically after you train with historical data, then given those 2 as inputs to the DeepONet, you can predict in the next 200 hours what is going to be the state of the charge that you produce, given a very, very simple that then anybody can use. Here it shows many other networks that, for example, LSTM that I used earlier would not work here because of the multi-rate dynamics. So what I told you so far is DeepONet provides a plurality of neural operators. Many other people try to mimic it. For example, at Caltech, some people propose something called the Fourier neural operator, and they make a big deal out of it. However, FNO is nothing else by, if you take this trunk net and put the sines and cosines, Fourier features, this is basically FNO. But DeepONet is much more than that. For example, it can process imaging data, it can process historical data. Let's say you have non-Newtonian fluids, rubber, and so on, plasticity. And it has a resemblance, as I showed down here, to human neurons. It doesn't exactly fire like a human neuron and so on. Now, given these capabilities, we're able to do things that we couldn't do before. I'm almost done. I have a couple more slides. So, for example, here, working with my collaborators from Yale University, we're able to go from the genotype. So we have they sacrifice a lot of mice. They sacrifice about, 300 mice. And they have different genotypes, five different genotypes. And then we're interested in this mouse model that gives you dissection of the aorta. So the aorta rupture somewhere here. So this is a common disease, and also it could be from injuries or genetic. But we're looking at signatures like mechanics. So we're looking at stresses, and we're looking at stretches, and so on. Can you infer which genotype corresponds to, right? That's, of course, very, very important, because then you would know what, from your genes, from your genome, you would know what type or what sort of the future. So this is something that we have done from genotype to phenotype, and of course from phenotype to genotype, with 85% accuracy. This DeepONet can be used in many different ways. For example, I'm not advocating to sort of drop what you're doing with finite elements, for example, those my friends in civil engineering or in other fields. But for example, imagine you're looking at a crack or a microstructure. You can take this part, so in the big domain, you can use finite element everywhere, but then you can train offline DeepONet to do molecular dynamics here, or very, very fine resolution, nonlinear finite elements. So then you plug in the DeepONet inside this big finite element computation. DeepONet can learn any of these, molecular dynamics and so on. It can learn to do that, and just basically communicating through the boundary conditions. As I said, we published this in Nature Machine Intelligence, and DeepMind, as you probably know, DeepMind, they're great institutions. They're interested now in science. But they wrote this two-pager. Here I have an excerpt from Irina Higgins, who wrote in the cover article that DeepONet can be used also to be trained using experimental data, but also use it for social dynamics, for which we know nothing. The Quantum magazine named DeepONet the fastest code on Earth. In fact, we demonstrated for hypersonic problems we're 100,000 times faster than CFD codes. But I want to finish here with a pessimistic note, and this is my last slide. And that is a recent study that was done at CSAIL at MIT by Neil Thompson and his collaborators, show that if you were looking at what's happening in deep learning now, the demands for computing, and they looked at 4 different areas, for example, speech recognition, imaging, and others, language. What's happening right now, the demands for computing are higher than what actually is available. So some people like Elon Musk suck the resources. And in fact, as you can see here, this is where NVIDIA started. There's no really true innovation in neural networks, apart from tweaking some architectures, doing some relatively simple math and so on, and being lucky most of the times, because you don't get unique answers with neural networks. So you have to be very, very careful. But the point is, this model is not sustainable. Just to improve the image net, which is a big neural network that was trained with billions of images from Stanford researchers like Fei and others. To improve the error by 1%, you need the electricity of 1 month of New York City. which will leave a huge footprint, carbon footprint also to the environment. So this is not sustainable. They asked Elon Musk, there was a mistake in GPT-3, and they asked him to retrain. He said, every time we retrain, it takes $5 million just to do a simple retraining of an already trained neural network. So this is not sustainable model. So people are looking into truly, not artificial neural networks, but truly biologically plausible neural networks. Of course, there we work with spikes. Our human neurons work with spikes. They don't use continuous forms. So here is the first time I show this because НΤUA is my alma mater. I wanted to show this first time here. Is spiking depot nets is something that we haven't published yet. But basically it takes as input spikes. You have to encode them in a certain way. Then you have to have a, here we use what's called leak and integrate function instead of the ad hoc activation functions of neural networks. And then you have to make the spikes continuous forms and so on. And there are many difficulties, mathematical difficulties with this because you cannot differentiate spikes and you need to take derivatives to do back propagate and so on. But there's no back propagation in the air, in the brain, so one has to actually abandon these ideas of back propagation that we are using in 99.99% of the neural networks use back propagation. What's the benefit? The benefit is the following. Currently, our brain uses about 20 watts. Maybe I use 20 watts giving this talk. However, GPT-3 of Elon Musk uses 20 megawatts. So there's a huge disparity in energy. However, going into this biologically plausible, because of the sparsity, because of the spikes, because of the very little memory that is required, we are hoping to bridge that gap. So this is the third wave of AI. It's called machine intelligence instead of machine learning. And with that, I would like to stop here and thank also one of my sponsors. And it's another consortium that I have sponsored by the Air Force. I would like to stop sharing here and I'll be happy to take questions. I can take questions in Greek or English. I will answer in English.
Thanks very much, Professor Karniadakis, for a very interesting talk indeed. And let me just say that the presentation and our speaker is now open to questions, and you can either raise your hand or write up questions on the chat, and I can transfer these to our speaker. So, any questions? I see a first question on the chat. So, do physics-informed neural networks substitute numerical methods for solving PDEs, as is the finite element method, or these can be actually combined in a synergetic manner?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get all these questions all the time. Our idea, I mean, our motivation was not to replace finite elements. Finite element methods are doing really well, and you know, my PhD thesis was on spectral elements, which is higher order finite elements, and we use that a lot. These pins could work like numerical solvers, but they're actually more expensive unless you're solving the inverse problem. If you solve the inverse problems, pins is probably the best, fastest method out there. However, for forward problems, it turns out that they're not as fast as finite elements. In the last example, I show how we can interface pins or depot nets with finite elements where, let's say you have a big problem, you solve at scale, but one part requires to resolve the microstructure. As you know, then all the cost of finite element will be on trying to resolve that microstructure. However, we can use neural networks, pins or depot nets in particular, or physics-informed depot nets, trained like, and then in that the depot net will take no time. All the cost then will be just, let's say, of your linear finite element solver. So to answer your question, pins are not supposed to replace these methods. They're supposed to complement them.
Perfect. Thanks very much. And Professor Boudouvis is asking if there are any particular efforts in cancer-related investigations.
I haven't done, although I work in biomedicine, but I haven't done. We're working mostly with sickle cell anemia, which are basically red blood cells that are also deformed. So I use this type of work and also CNN for imaging in sickle cell anemia and in the spleen. But I'm not sure I've seen any pins yet in cancer. These both methods, the pins and deponent, are application agnostic. So it's just a matter of who is using it and in what context, actually.
Thanks very much. I see a raise hand by Professor Belibasakis and then Professor Protonotarios.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Karniadakis, with a fascinating talk and subject. I'm very interested in many things and topics and on the seed-keeping problem that you discussed. And my question is more general. I understand from the definition of the development of the pins that there is a blend between neural networks and physics model. And my question is, do we have any kind of rule or suggestion, of course, depending on the particular problem, or how much sophisticated the neural network should be, or how much sophisticated we would like the physics in order to obtain a best blend from the point of view of, let's say, both computational and accuracy cost? That's my question. How much sophisticated should we do in this balance in order to, if there is some kind of rule of thumb?
Right. That is really the holy grail in the field right now, because it's hard to have. We do have theoretical paper, but they're not there yet to give you sharp answers. And the other difficulty is the theoretical work can be done on the approximation level, but unfortunately, the big error, so what we call the big elephant, is the optimization error and the empirical error or sampling the finite distribution. So we don't have a good answer to it. But for the physics, it's something that you have to develop per field. For example, I show you how you can use historical data. If you use historical data and you put everything in a Bayesian framework, I think it's much better, because you do get also the uncertainty for free. Also, you can extrapolate. I didn't show here results, but you can extrapolate way beyond the training domain in space-time. So I would say using functional priors, where you use, if you don't know the physics and you don't want to commit too much to it, use the physics as a functional prior. With any other historical data, will be much better than actually enforcing it directly into the loss function. So that would be a way to. But another way is to parameterize the physics as much as you want, because remember, a neural network has about 100,000 or 1 million parameters, like trying to find with gradient descent, right? The hyperparameters. Now, if you introduce 10 parameters in the PDE, which usually we don't dare doing, but now these are 10 parameters are lumped together with 100,000 parameters. So you don't add any cost. So we find those parameters in the physics the same way we find the hyperparameters, the weights and the bias of the neural network, namely using a steepest gradient descent. So it's very easy. So my advice is to parameterize the equations as much as, if you don't know, for example, constitutive equations in materials or in fluids, you write the most general equation, you find the coefficients could be 0, in which case you simplify. But that's, so in other words, because people ask me model misspecification, what is, so I encourage people to write a very generous parameterization and then simplifying those parameters. If you look at our papers, we write the PDE as a function of lambda. That lambda is a vector of parameters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikos Protonotarios, then Professor Spiliopoulos, and then Professor Lagaros.
Hello, everyone. Professor Karniadakis, thanks so much for such an educational lecture. you've covered so many apparently huge results. I've never seen anything like this. So many packed huge results in 60 minutes. I'm interested, except apart from pins, obviously, I'm also interested in what you said about the approximation of functionals, and maybe generalizing the work by Sipenko. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Can you elucidate further this topic? But because I think it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, you're right about it, and it was actually, as I said, it's one of the jewels in approximation theory that was the most well-kept secret, so to speak. Sipenko theorem is well known now. It's a universal approximation theorem. Hornig and Maskar in the early 90s, they developed similar work also for now more recently in deep neural networks. Nobody looked at the functionals, and when I started looking at functionals, you know, you go to these blogs these days and they say, oh yeah, it's so cool, I can approximate a functional. And then somebody else says, no, you cannot. So I was looking for theory. And then I ran into 87 years young Professor Chen from Fudan University and this paper. The paper, it's...
the one you mentioned, Chen and Chen 1993, right?
Yes. So that basically is for a single hidden layer. The requirements, for example, the function itself has to be continuous. The function has to be continuous, and the input space has to be a compact space.
Right.
The same thing for the nonlinear operators, which are kind of, if you think about it, I said I use Gauss random fields. So I violate the compactness hypothesis, right? Also for my operator, I had this continuous data. I mean, I had atomistic data and I had continuum data. That was a discontinuous operator, so I violate that. How did that happen? Well, if you are interested in the theory of this, there's actually there was a paper. I skipped the one page. I skipped. That was a paper by Sid Mishra from ETH. Sidney Mishra. I'm also a co-author with his students. 120 pages paper that it's really the Bible of theory now on approximating operators, and then you can also extend that to functionals. I haven't seen anybody taking that work and make it specific to functionals. We simply use the deep neural networks for the same reason. The difficulty, as I said, it was. We also have a different, if you look at our paper in Nature Machine Intelligence, we have a different proof for deep neural networks. We do it with, it's a constructive proof. Chen and Chen is following basically the approximation theory of Sipenko, where they assume, you have to have activation functions which are non-polynomials. And then there's some other assumptions, relatively mild assumptions. But as I said, you can remove now, for example, the discontinuity. You can have any Borel measure operator is fine, and then you don't need to have a compact input space. It can be infinite space.
Or even rational functions, or either Padé approximators, or you name it.
Yes, exactly.
Again, many thanks.
Can I ask you, are you related to Professor Protonotarios?
Yeah, I'm his son, yes.
Okay, thanks very much. I took his class, and he inspired me to go abroad, so thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. So our next question by Professor Spiliopoulos and then Professor Lagaros.
Thank you very much, Professor Karniadakis, for giving us this enlightening, this very nice talk, very advanced talk, I would say, with so much information. And I would like, as the director of the Institute of Structural Analysis, to congratulate Professor Triantafyllou, who is a member of our institute, for organizing this talk. So first of all, thank you very much. Now, a simple question. I mean, going through all this material that you have done in the past, we are actually working in the field of nonlinear structural mechanics. Do you think that machine learning methods at the moment is in position to produce good solutions in nonlinear mechanics?
It's not a simple question. That's a very difficult question. But I would say one area, and I'm not a mechanics, nonlinear mechanics expert, but I work very closely with one of the pioneers of materials in Subra Suresh, if you know who he is. Yeah. I would say that these methods that I describe here, especially pins, and deponent would be, and they're used a lot these days for identifying the constitutive relation, the inverse problem, where you have some data, you know nothing, that you don't know the functional form, or it could be parameterized, but that's easier. For example, one of my collaborators, Charbel Farhat from Stanford, is using it to find constitutive loss of a parachutes that land on Mars, let's say. That's a NASA project where they use pins to identify. Or some other material, some other companies work with tires. I've seen they use pins to identify the constitutive equation of rubber in the tires. So it's become very specific. So as I said, I have recently we published a paper in Science Advances with Subra, where we had all sorts of different materials, from metallic to hyperelastic and so on. And we had voids and we had inclusions inside the materials. We didn't know how many voids, we didn't know what type of inclusion, we didn't know the shape. So let's take a simple experiment. Of course, you can do now DIC and so on, but let's take a simple experiment and pull this by actual testing. And I have measurements of the displacements at the boundaries, about a dozen of them, a dozen measurements. Can you identify how many holes and where are the holes? And if there are inclusions, can you identify the modules of elasticity of the inclusion? That's a difficult problem. Now, to generate data, we did a lot of abacus simulations. Okay, I could use pins to do simulations, but the forward simulation, where you know where the hole is and you generate data, it takes like 1 minute with abacus. It takes 1 hour with pins. So pins is expensive. Now we are solving we are solving the inverse problem, because I'm given data and I want to know where the holes. That takes 6 months with abacus because you don't know the topology, but it takes still 1 hour with pins because I use exactly the same code, the same method, no meshes, nothing. So that's why I said it's where you use it. So I would not say that you replace everything you do with finite elements, which is a very good method. That's why at the end I propose this blending of also these neural networks don't scale well. If you go to we are not Elon Musk to spend $5 million for training every time we do one case. So you use finite elements everywhere, let's say in a wing, but you know that you want to zoom in part of the wing. That part can be done with neural networks because you may have some data where you can incorporate data from elsewhere to find what's going on there and so on. Sort of in an inverse or a hybrid mode. I would favor the use of that, but I wouldn't favor, at this juncture, as 2022, I would not favor replacing good abacus, Nastran, and other solvers with this type of approaches. I hope I answered your question.
Yes,
it's really a difficult question.
Yes, I understand that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. I see 2 raised hands from Professor Georgiou and Professor Boudouvis.
I think that Nikos Lagaros is ahead of us.
Apologies, yeah, and Professor Lagaros, who was first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Karniadakis, for this excellent lecture. It was very informative for us. Also, you mentioned it in your presentation, the article that you mentioned about computational limits of deep learning, the increased computational effort, the increased computational capabilities that we are having now, made machine learning more popular than they were before. And I would like your comment on how image processing, that is a strong feature of deep learning, can be also a feature of physics, and how image processing can be used in physics and mechanics.
That's a very good question. In fact, I just mentioned DIC, for example. We have also used infrared cameras to capture temperature on a patch, like an inch by inch. And these are extremely valuable data. In the NIH work for National Institute of Health work I'm doing for thoracic dissections, I just actually put a paper on the archive yesterday, where we use images of the aorta, and then we use a CNN, a convolutional neural network, which is appropriate, to take those images at the diastole at two instances of the cardiac cycle, systolic and diastolic, and from that we can actually prognose if there are any problems with rupture of the aorta or other insults that could happen. So imaging could be nicely incorporated. In another project we're looking here at Boston Harbor, we're looking at the ocean acidification, like the pH and so on. You have no ways of getting that, but we have lots of measurements from satellites for salinity and sea surface temperature. And then we have some in situ measurement from Massachusetts Water Authority. So by combining and doing a sort of multi-fidelity, we actually have now, so it's all images from satellite images. We process them through CNN, and we can synergistically use them with in situ measurements to predict the temperature of the ocean everywhere, instead of one point that they used to have, and also the uncertainty. But I see image in bioimaging is one of the modalities that used heavily, both in non-destructive evaluation. You can see, for example, for the experiment that I showed with the ultrasound, that was the looking for a hole using imaging. So that's really very dense information. So the advances, of course, that have been taking place in commercial machine learning, especially on imaging, can be totally used synergistically in as the data part, as a very rich data part. In fact, here in my talk today, I was trying to kind of say that, right? I started with a coffee, which was only images, Sliden photography. Then I talk about the mask for the COVID-19. Then I talk about the ultrasound. So these are all images. I was trying to say that this type of information is really very valuable because it's very dense. So I think, but to answer your question, I don't think yet people have exploited that. More people in radiology and biomedicine are thinking about it, how they can use multimodality inputs, let's say genomics plus histology. But there, from the mathematical side, is also interesting because you have point measurements and you have to define the right norms and so on. So I see a huge opportunity there. So some people have done it. A lot of people are talking about it, but that interface has not been fully exploited yet.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I answer your question, not another question. I digress maybe a little.
So our two final questions, by starting with Professor Georgiou and finishing up with Professor Boudouvis.
Good afternoon, everybody. Really, it's a very, very interesting talk, and I have read some of the papers of George Karniadakis, and understand you move this direction from your computational experience by solving partial differential equations from this standpoint. So, and I see now using neural networks
And then you bring in the physics through the partial differential equations, which describe, of course, the physics. Very interesting. And we see some very interesting problems to be solved. But I have the following question. If I have a physical system in front of me, and I don't have a partial differential equation, but I can collect information using sensors. There are a lot of sensors with very good capabilities. And what if I could do a very targeted experiment with distributed sensors and exciting my system with pulses so I can have the most information, and then use this information to construct reduced dynamics, find the dynamics in a reduced space. And then certainly these reduced dynamics, they have inside them, in terms of numerics, the physics of the system. And take this instead of the partial differential equations and do physics informed through these reduced dynamics, but taking them, extracting them only from physical experiments. What do you think about this idea?
Yeah, no, this is actually some of our popular paper was addressing exactly this machine learning of physics from data. We also have a paper that was is highly cited, but again, it was rejected because we published it too early, 2017, where we we just have data and we try to discover ODEs and PDEs I have one paper where we use real data from porous media, and we derive equations implicitly on the neural network, exactly the way you described it. Now, sometimes people want to see, familiar equations, and in that case, for the porous media, we demonstrated that after you have the neural network, you just have a library of operators, and you parameterize that, and then you can do a lasso regression, and then you can find an explicit form of equations. In one of our papers, we actually found new equations for porous media using fractional derivatives, where we combine advection and diffusion into a derivative with exponent 1.5, for example. Many people actually are in the business what you're describing, not using real data, but synthetic data. And then they and then they discover, sort of quote unquote, the same equations that we very well know. I have a project with Cummings, and I should have shown that because I talked to engineers here, but I didn't. So the Cummings, they give us lots of data. They have 7 sensors on their engines. And from that, we find the system of ODEs, which is specific to this engine. And it's also not only engine specific, but it's also age specific. As the engine is aging, the equations are changing. The neural network is changing. And of course, this is for monitoring the environment and also the discharges and so on. So yes, this is very useful, as I said, if it's done using real data. In fact, in the third slide of today's talk, I had the bucket, the black bucket, had no physics at all. I mentioned social dynamics because it's easy to associate, but in geophysics, there's many processes that's very hard to describe, for example. And that's where DeepONet, in fact, does exactly that. It's one way of describing the physics using DeepONet, lots of measurements. The problem is, if you don't have a lot of measurements, you have to improvise. But if you have a lot of data, there are many different ways. My group and other groups by Nathan Kutz, Yannis Kevrekidis and others, Yannis has this idea of gray box, which I like more than the black box, that you may know some part, you don't know others. So every time you know some part, let's say advection, diffusion, you can parameterize that. Then you have a part that you don't know, could be a functional form, you find it from the measurements. But I believe, to answer your question, it's a great area for complex systems, for engineering systems, especially if you have a lot of sensors. But I would say a totally black box would be difficult for real systems. A gray box like Yanis Kevrekiris is advocating, I think it's a better idea.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll make it very quick if I can. But before I ask my question, George, you might want to know that Isaac Lagaris is in the audience. And the question is about the cheap data. If you have cheap data, even from inaccurate that is data from actual measurements or data from coarse discretizations, can they be of any use or maybe dangerous or poisoning your models?
That's a good question, Andreas. We have actually addressed that in one of our papers, in the series of papers, where we use multi-fidelity approaches. Multi-fidelity approaches, and I just had a workshop last Friday on multi-fidelity training of DeepONet, where we're 3 different applications: wind farms, ice melting, and metamaterials. The situation is exactly what you described. Either you have very coarse simulations, and then you can afford some fine simulations, or you have some experimental data. So this is the multi-fidelity approach. So usually the way I approach this is I have 2 neural networks. We have the first paper on neural networks on multi-fidelity. It's our paper. It's very popular. So we have the high fidelity data, what we call the gold data, and the low fidelity data could be silver or bronze data with lower fidelity. So usually I put the experimental data with all the uncertainties, all the noise. I put them on the top because that's the reality. So that's my gold data. And then I improvise with simulation data of high resolution, medium resolution, of low resolution, because you need a lot of data. Actually, this is one, I talked earlier about mechanics and nano indentation. We wrote a paper with Subrasures. We have a patent on nano indentation. There we were looking at 3D printed materials. What is the yield stress for a 3D printed materials? My collaborator Subrasures is the world expert on that. And his formulas are 125% in error when it comes to 3D printed materials because the microstructure is a layer one. So his methods didn't work. So they did an experiment. They only had 10 measurements, not thousands of measurements. 10 measurements for a titanium alloy or a nickel alloy. You cannot do much with 10 measurements. But you know these are the reality, right? Because then we did 100 3D finite element simulations and 500 2D finite element simulations for the same setup, nano indentation. And we reduced the yield stress from 125% error to 4% error. This method now, it's actually part of a software that we promote with this company Analytica that I mentioned earlier. So it works actually in real practice. It's on cloud. One can use it on cloud. So multi-fidelity is really very useful for engineering data, for biomedical data, because you never have enough data of the type that you want. So now, how would you know that it's very important to capture the accuracy? So in the alphabet of pins, I talked about B-pin, Bayesian pin, is one of the versions that we have. So you need to capture the uncertainty from the data, from basically the way multi-fidelity works is like co-kriging for those of you who do geophysics. Co-kriging is a GPR, Gauss process regression. And if you have high fidelity and low fidelity, and they're linearly correlated, you just make the correlation coefficient a unknown that you find from the data. We extended this idea to making the coefficient a nonlinear function and have a neural network to discover the nonlinear correlation function. And then you upscale the low fidelity to high fidelity. So I think that's kind of to answer. But you may have seen when I look at when I had the third slide, I call the 5D law that the data is dinky, which means small, dirty, which means noisy, dynamic, and also deceptive, because like the guy who gave me this data, I didn't show this data today. He said the Russians are always there, so deceptive is for adversarial data. So you have to deal with that. In fact, we have a case where we have some of the data being correlated or anti-correlated with high fidelity. And the neural network acts like a nonlinear filter. It will only keep the correlated data. So it will use the low fidelity data. It is a very important topic because I work with like a dozen companies now. They're all interested in to do chip, like you said, on the chip. You cannot afford, you have a fixed budget when you work in a company. So you want to do with 10 measurements, you want to train a neural network. So you have to improvise with synthetic data or prior knowledge and so on.
Thank you, George.
Thanks very much. And with that, I'm sure we all have lots to think about. There are many more questions, but we should really bring this to a closure. I would like very much once again to thank our speaker, Professor Karniadakis. I would like to thank all of you who attended this ISAAR seminar. And you will all be able to find online the recording on YouTube. So thanks again. Thanks once more. And look out for our next seminar notification. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your kind invitation. Good to see you all, good friends.
How about next fall, George, for another lecture?
Sure.
Let's plan on that.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.